The courtroom fell silent as Judge Judy's gavel hit the bench with a force that made even the camera crew jump. Marcus Wellington sat across from her, his $3,000 suit pristine, his gold Rolex catching the studio lights as he leaned back in his chair, with the kind of smirk that had intimidated housing inspectors for over 2 decades. This wasn't just any landlord facing America's toughest judge. This was the man who owned 847 rental properties across 3 states, a slumlord empire worth over $200 million built on the suffering of families who had nowhere else to go. But Judge Judy had just delivered a threat that would have sent any rational property owner scrambling for their lawyer. Instead, Marcus Wellington did something that would destroy his entire fortune in less than 36 seconds. Wellington thought he knew exactly how this would play out. He'd faced judges before, dozens of them, and walked away with nothing more than slapped wrists and minimal fines that were simply the cost of doing business in his world of substandard housing and tenant exploitation. At 54, he'd built his reputation on being untouchable, the kind of landlord who could ignore court orders, dismiss housing violations, and laugh at tenant complaints because he knew the system was too slow and too bureaucratic to stop him. His properties were scattered across low-income neighborhoods where tenants had limited legal resources and even fewer options. Wellington had mastered the art of keeping people trapped in his decaying buildings while maximizing every penny of profit from their desperation. Judge Judy had been studying his file for 3 days straight, and what she discovered would have made most people physically sick. 23 families living without heat in the middle of winter. Children developing respiratory problems from black mold that covered entire bedroom walls. Elderly tenants forced to use buckets to catch water from leaking roofs while paying rent that consumed 80% of their fixed incomes. But the most damning evidence was sitting right there in front of her. A man who had just spent the last 10 minutes explaining to America's most beloved judge why his tenants deserved exactly what they got, because they couldn't afford to live anywhere better. Wellington had no idea that Judge Judy possessed something no other judge he'd faced had ever wielded against him. Hidden in her legal arsenal was an emergency authority that could bypass months of bureaucratic delays and seize properties immediately when tenant safety was at imminent risk. The paperwork was already prepared. The federal marshals were already on standby. The housing authority officials were already positioned outside his most profitable buildings. All she needed was one more display of the arrogance that had brought him to her courtroom. One final moment of disrespect that would give her legal justification to activate the most devastating property seizure order in television history. That's when Marcus Wellington made the single worst decision of his entire life. As Judge Judy leaned forward and delivered her final warning about what would happen to landlords who treated human beings like disposable profit margins, Wellington's face broke into that same condescending smile that had haunted his tenants for years. The sound that came out of his mouth next would echo through legal circles for decades to come and cost him everything he'd spent his career building. What he didn't know was that Judge Judy had been waiting her entire career for a landlord exactly like him, someone arrogant enough to laugh directly at justice itself. The countdown to his destruction had already begun, and in 36 seconds, the most powerful slumlord on the East Coast would become just another cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate the woman who made a career out of destroying people who thought they were above the law. Before we dive into this incredible takedown, hit that like button if you want to see more moments where arrogant slumlords get exactly what they deserve, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest courtroom justice. Now let's see how America's favorite judge absolutely destroyed a landlord who thought he was untouchable. The hearing was supposed to be routine. Judge Judy had seen thousands of landlord-tenant disputes over her decades on television, but Marcus Wellington represented something far more sinister than the typical negligent property owner. His empire had been built systematically over 23 years, starting with a single apartment building in Newark that he'd purchased for $180,000 and immediately stopped maintaining. While other landlords at least pretended to care about basic habitability, Wellington had perfected a business model that treated human suffering as acceptable overhead. He'd discovered that low-income tenants were trapped by circumstance, credit histories, and limited housing options, making them the perfect captive customer base for his deteriorating properties. Wellington's operation was ruthlessly efficient. He owned 847 rental units across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, with a combined value that insurance adjusters estimated at $203 million. But his real genius wasn't in acquiring properties. It was in maximizing profit by spending absolutely nothing on maintenance while charging rent that pushed families to the breaking point. His buildings were strategic investments in desperation, located in neighborhoods where tenants had nowhere else to go and limited resources to fight back. Housing inspectors had cited his properties 1,147 times in the past 5 years alone, But Wellington had learned to navigate the legal system like a chess master, using delays, appeals, and technicalities to avoid any meaningful consequences. At 54, Wellington had built his reputation on being absolutely untouchable. He drove a $150,000 Mercedes, lived in a $2.3 million mansion in the suburbs, and sent his 3 children to elite private schools, all funded by families who lived in buildings where heat barely worked in winter, and air conditioning was non-existent in summer. His legal team consisted of 7 attorneys who specialized in tenant intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation. They'd perfected the art of making simple repairs so expensive and complicated through legal challenges that most tenants simply gave up and accepted living conditions that would shock anyone with alternatives. But Judge Judy represented everything Wellington had never encountered in his career of exploiting the vulnerable. At 81, she'd spent over 4 decades fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, first as a family court judge in New York, and then as television's most feared legal authority. Her reputation for destroying arrogant defendants wasn't built on theatrical performance. It was built on an encyclopedic knowledge of housing law and an absolute intolerance for people who profited from human misery. Wellington had researched her before appearing on the show, but he'd made the fatal mistake of assuming that television judges were simply entertainment personalities who couldn't actually enforce real legal consequences. What Wellington didn't know was that Judge Judy had spent 3 months preparing for this specific case after receiving a file that contained some of the most disturbing housing violations she'd ever encountered. 23 families in his Newark building had been living without adequate heat for an entire winter, with indoor temperatures dropping to 41 degrees, while Wellington collected $47,000 in monthly rent from the same tenants who were forced to warm their children's bottles over candles. The photographs in her file showed black mold covering bedroom walls where infants slept, kitchen ceilings that leaked sewage from upstairs bathrooms, and electrical systems so dangerous that fire inspectors had threatened to evacuate entire buildings. The stakes in this confrontation couldn't be higher. This wasn't just about one slumlord or even one television show. This was about a legal precedent that could change how housing violations were enforced across the country. Judge Judy had been granted emergency authority under a little-known federal statute that allowed immediate property seizure when tenant safety was deemed at imminent risk. The paperwork authorizing her to bypass traditional court procedures had been approved by federal housing officials who'd been tracking Wellington's empire for years, waiting for the right moment to make an example that would send shockwaves through the slumlord industry nationwide. The case that brought Marcus Wellington to Judge Judy's courtroom started with a phone call that would haunt anyone with a conscience. Maria Santos, a 34-year-old single mother of 3, had been living in Wellington's Newark building for 18 months, paying the $400 monthly for a 2-bedroom apartment that was slowly poisoning her family. When the temperature dropped to 15 degrees in February, her apartment's broken heating system left her children sleeping in winter coats, while Wellington's property manager ignored 17 separate repair requests. But the heat was just the beginning of a nightmare that would expose the systematic cruelty of Wellington's empire. The black mold covering 8-year-old Sophia's bedroom wall had triggered asthma attacks so severe that Maria rushed her daughter to the emergency room 4 times in 3 months. Hospital bills totaling $11,000 were crushing the family financially, but Wellington's response to Maria's desperate pleas for mold remediation was a rent increase notice and a threat of eviction if she continued complaining. The photographs Maria brought to court showed conditions that belonged in a horror movie, not a place where children were supposed to sleep safely. Thick, dark mold colonies spread across an entire wall like cancer, while ceiling tiles hung dangerously loose from water damage that had been ignored for over a year. Judge Judy's expression grew darker with each piece of evidence Maria presented. The documentation was overwhelming and damning. 17 separate maintenance requests submitted through Wellington's online portal, each marked as received but never addressed. Medical records showing Sophia's worsening respiratory condition directly correlated with exposure to toxic mold. Photographs time-stamped over 6 months showing the progressive deterioration of living conditions, while rent payments continued to be collected on time. But the most devastating evidence was Wellington's own written response to Maria's complaints, an email that would be read aloud in court for millions of viewers to hear. Wellington's property manager had sent Maria a message that revealed the callous calculation behind his business model. Tenant complaints about minor cosmetic issues like wall discoloration are not grounds for rent reduction or emergency repairs. If current living conditions are unsatisfactory, we recommend seeking alternative housing arrangements. Property improvements are scheduled based on cost-benefit analysis, not individual tenant preferences. The email continued with a threat that perfectly captured Wellington's approach to tenant relations. Further complaints may result in lease termination proceedings and negative references that could affect future housing applications. Judge Judy had seen slumlord tactics before, but Wellington's systematic approach to tenant exploitation was operating on an industrial scale that shocked even her seasoned perspective. The Santos family case was just one file in a stack of 43 similar complaints that had been submitted against Wellington's properties in the past year alone. Each case followed the same pattern: desperate tenants trapped in deteriorating conditions, ignored maintenance requests, medical emergencies caused by habitability issues, and threats of eviction whenever families tried to demand basic human dignity. The pattern wasn't coincidental. It was the foundation of a business model that treated housing as a weapon against the poor. The hearing was about to begin, and Wellington sat confidently in his designer suit, apparently unaware that Judge Judy had spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing evidence that painted him as one of the most heartless landlords she'd encountered in 4 decades of legal practice. His smirk suggested he expected this to be another routine performance where his lawyers would minimize damages, and he'd walk away with nothing more than a minor financial inconvenience. What he couldn't have imagined was that Judge Judy had already activated legal mechanisms that would turn his own arrogance into the trigger for his complete destruction. Judge Judy had heard enough. After 27 minutes of testimony about black mold poisoning children, families freezing in winter, and medical emergencies caused by uninhabitable conditions, she leaned forward with the intensity that had made her America's most feared legal authority. Her voice cut through the courtroom silence like a blade as she delivered what should have been Marcus Wellington's final warning. Mr. Wellington, I want you to understand something very clearly. When landlords like you treat human beings as disposable profit margins, when you collect rent from families living in conditions that would shock a reasonable person, you're not just violating housing codes. You're committing a crime against basic human decency, and I have the authority to make sure you never harm another family again. The courtroom held its collective breath. Maria Santos sat in the witness section, tears streaming down her face as she thought about her daughter's asthma attacks and the mold-covered bedroom where Sophia was afraid to sleep. The audience of tenant rights advocates leaned forward, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Judge Judy's tone had shifted from stern judicial authority to something far more dangerous, the voice of someone who'd seen enough suffering and was about to end it permanently. But Marcus Wellington, in his $3,000 suit and gold Rolex, was about to make a decision that would destroy everything he'd spent 23 years building. Mr. Wellington, Judge Judy continued, her eyes locked on his face. I'm prepared to authorize the immediate seizure of your properties under federal emergency housing provisions. Your tenants will be relocated to safe, habitable housing at your expense, and your rental licenses will be permanently revoked across all 3 states where you operate. Do you understand the gravity of what I'm telling you? The legal mechanism she was referencing was real and devastating. Federal marshals were already positioned outside his most profitable buildings. Housing authority officials had paperwork ready to assume control of 8 and 47 rental units. The emergency seizure order required only her signature to activate, and she was holding the pen that would end his empire forever. That's when Marcus Wellington made the single most catastrophic error in slumlord history. Instead of the fear or contrition that any rational person would display when facing complete financial destruction, Wellington's face broke into the same condescending smirk that had tormented his tenants for decades. The sound that came out of his mouth next would be replayed millions of times across social media and studied in law schools as the moment arrogance destroyed a man's entire fortune. Wellington let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the silent courtroom, followed by words that sealed his fate. Judge, with all due respect, you're running a television show, not a real court. You can't seize anything, and we both know these people are just looking for a payday they don't deserve. The transformation in Judge Judy's expression was immediate and terrifying. The pen in her hand moved across the seizure authorization with swift, decisive strokes as Wellington's laughter still hung in the air. Mr. Wellington, she said, her voice now carrying the cold fury of absolute authority, you just laughed your way out of a $203 million fortune. Federal marshals are taking possession of your properties as we speak. Your rental empire is finished, your licenses are permanently revoked, and you'll be personally liable for relocating every family you've been poisoning with your negligence. The timer on the courtroom wall showed exactly 36 seconds had passed from the moment his laughter began to the moment Judge Judy signed the order that would make him a cautionary tale for slumlords nationwide. Wellington's smirk vanished as the reality hit him like a physical blow. The confident man who'd walked into the courtroom believing he was untouchable suddenly looked like someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. presumably to call his legal team, but Judge Judy wasn't finished destroying him. "Put the phone down, Mr. Wellington. Your lawyers can't help you now. You just laughed at justice itself, and justice is about to laugh back. Can you believe how quickly karma caught up with this arrogant slumlord? If you're loving this instant justice, smash that like button and let us know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's arrogance backfire this spectacularly? Don't forget to subscribe because we've got more courtroom takedowns coming your way." The enforcement was swift and brutal. Within minutes of Judge Judy's signature hitting the seizure order, Wellington's phone started buzzing with calls from panicked property managers across 3 states. Federal marshals were simultaneously arriving at his most profitable buildings, armed with court orders that gave them immediate authority to assume control of every rental unit in his empire. The coordination was military precise, the result of months of planning by housing authorities who'd been waiting for exactly this moment to make an example that would terrify slumlords nationwide. Wellington sat frozen in his chair, watching his $203 million empire evaporate in real time through a series of frantic text messages. Marshals at Newark building, tenants cheering, read one. Pennsylvania properties sealed, local news arriving, came another. His hands shook as he scrolled through dozens of notifications, each one representing another nail in the coffin of his rental dynasty. The man who'd spent decades terrorizing families with eviction threats was now experiencing his own form of immediate displacement. But instead of losing a home, he was losing everything. The destruction of Wellington's empire unfolded with methodical precision that would have impressed a military strategist. Property by property, building by building, his rental dynasty collapsed as federal authorities executed the most comprehensive housing seizure in television history. At 2:47 p.m., marshals took control of his crown jewel, the 84-unit Newark complex that generated $47,000 monthly. By 3:15 p.m., his Philadelphia properties worth $31 million were under federal management. The Pennsylvania Housing Authority had been preparing for this moment for 18 months, armed with documentation of 312 separate code violations that Wellington had ignored while collecting over $180,000 in monthly rent from families living in substandard conditions. Wellington's financial devastation was calculated down to the penny. The immediate seizure cost him $203 million in property assets, but the real financial catastrophe was just beginning. He was now personally liable for relocating 847 families to habitable housing at his expense, an obligation that housing officials estimated would cost him an additional $12.7 million in the first year alone. His legal team, which had once seemed invincible, was now scrambling to limit damages rather than challenge the seizure. The emergency federal authority Judge Judy had invoked was ironclad, backed by decades of legal precedent that courts had used to protect tenants from immediate health hazards. The human cost of Wellington's greed became starkly visible as tenants emerged from buildings they'd been ashamed to call home. Maria Santos stood outside her former nightmare apartment, tears of relief streaming down her face as housing officials explained that Sophia would finally have a bedroom without toxic mold. 8-year-old children who'd been sleeping in winter coats for months would have heat. Elderly tenants who'd been catching sewage in buckets would have working plumbing. Families who'd been trapped by circumstance and limited options suddenly had advocates with real power, fighting for their basic human dignity. Wellington's attempts at damage control were pathetic and desperate. His publicist issued statements claiming the seizure was politically motivated, but the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. His lawyers filed emergency appeals that were dismissed within hours by judges who'd reviewed the same photographic evidence Judge Judy had seen. Local news stations ran investigative reports featuring Wellington's own tenants, describing years of neglect and intimidation. The man who'd built his fortune on exploiting the voiceless had given them the most powerful platform imaginable to tell their stories of his systematic cruelty. The aftermath of Marcus Wellington's spectacular downfall became a case study that housing authorities across the nation would reference for decades to come. Within 6 months of that fatal 36-second laugh, Wellington had declared personal bankruptcy, lost his $2.3 million mansion, and faced criminal charges for operating unsafe housing conditions. His children were forced to transfer from elite private schools to public education, while his wife filed for divorce to protect whatever assets remained from his legal catastrophe. The man who'd built a fortune on human misery discovered that karma had a perfect sense of timing and an even better sense of justice. The ripple effects extended far beyond one slumlord's destroyed empire. Housing officials in 12 states began implementing emergency seizure protocols modeled after Judge Judy's swift action. Tenant advocacy groups saw donations skyrocket as the public rallied behind families who'd been trapped in uninhabitable conditions. Law schools added the Wellington case to their curricula as an example of how emergency housing authority could protect vulnerable populations when traditional bureaucratic processes moved too slowly to prevent imminent harm. Judge Judy's legacy was cemented, not just as television's toughest judge, but as someone who'd used her platform to deliver real justice for people who needed it most. The emergency federal authority she'd wielded wasn't theatrical television drama. It was legitimate legal power that she'd deployed with surgical precision against someone who'd spent decades believing he was above consequences. Maria Santos and her daughter Sophia moved into a safe, mold-free apartment paid for by Wellington's seized assets, while 846 other families experienced the dignity of habitable housing for the first time in years. Wellington himself became a cautionary tale whispered among property owners who'd been cutting corners on tenant safety. His name became synonymous with the dangers of treating housing as a weapon against the poor, a reminder that someone was always watching and that justice might arrive faster than anyone expected. Thanks for watching this incredible moment of instant justice. If you want to see more arrogant defendants get exactly what they deserve in Judge Judy's courtroom, smash that like button and subscribe to never miss the latest legal takedowns. And let us know in the comments, what do you think about Judge Judy's swift action against this slumlord? Was this the most satisfying courtroom moment you've ever seen? We'll see you in the next video where we break down another case where justice was served in the most unexpected way, and someone's arrogance cost them everything they thought they'd built.